Today I'm going to show you how I made the intro for my channel. The end result won't be exactly the same, but it should give you a good idea of what is involved in creating something like this, and since there are a lot of moving parts, you will learn something by the end of the video one way or another. So let's begin. The first thing you're going to do is open a new general file. Then I'm going to delete the light and the cube. I'm going to leave the camera there because that will be very important when I render it out. With those out of the way, I'm going to add a plane. So add, mesh, plane. Then, in the Object Properties tab, I'm going to scale this plane up to 10. Now, with the plane still highlighted, I'm going to click on the Physics Properties tab and click on Rigid Body. This will make the plane behave like a physical object. I'm going to change the type to passive, and under settings I'm going to check this box titled animated. Then under collisions I'm going to change the shape to a mesh. Now I'm going to duplicate this plane 4 times to create walls. So I hit Shift D to duplicate this plane. I hit X and drag the mouse to move it so that the midpoint is at one of the edges of the original plane. Then I left click. It doesn't have to be touching, as long as it's close it'll be fine. Then I'm going to rotate this plane 90 degrees on the y-axis and move it vertically upwards on the z-axis. I'm now going to repeat this process but for the other sides. So with this new face highlighted, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate it. Then I'm going to hit X and slide it to the other side of the plane and left click. I'm going to duplicate this again, so Shift D, hit X, bring it roughly to the center and then click. Now I'm going to rotate it on the z-axis by 90 degrees and then slide it to this face on the y-axis. Then finally, duplicate it again, press Y to drag it on the y-axis with the mouse, move it to the wall on the other end, and click. Again, it doesn't have to be exact, but what you should end up with is a box with no top, and the reason I did this with planes instead of a cube for instance, is that eventually I want these faces to move independently of each other. Now I'm gonna go up here and make these walls invisible. They'll still physically exist in the world, but we don't need to see them right now. This will make things much easier to look at. Now we're going to add the text. So add, then text. We're going to raise this text on the vertical axis. Under text properties, we're going to make sure the alignment is centered. Then we're going to go up here and switch object mode to edit mode. This will allow us to edit the text. With the text still highlighted, now you can delete the sample text that is already there and type what you want to see, which in my case would be Blender Blitz. Now, return to object mode. Under the Text Properties tab, there is a drop-down menu called Geometry. Under Geometry is a value called Extrude with a default value of 0. I'm going to want to drag that up to roughly 0.17 meters. Again, doesn't have to be exact. Then we want to go back to the object properties and scale it up to 2.5 on every axis. With this done, we now want to right-click the text and convert it to a mesh. Now that it's a mesh, we can add rigid body physics to it. So with the text mesh still highlighted, go to Physics Properties and click Rigid Body. I'm going to tick the box next to animated, and I'm going to change the shape to mesh. Then, I'll move it vertically upwards a little more for good measure. And now it's time to populate this box with spheres. So the first thing I'm going to do is add mesh UV sphere. I'm going to scale it down to 0.4 on all axes. Then I'm going to raise it up over the plane and then move it right into the corner here. This is easier to do with the top-down view, so over here you can click the blue Z button. With the sphere still highlighted, we're going to go into the Physics Properties tab and add a rigid body. We're going to change the mass to 0.3 kilograms, and we're actually going to leave animated unchecked. This way the spheres will just behave in accordance with gravity, as opposed to being manually controlled by the animation system. And under collisions, I'm going to change the shape to a sphere. Then, under surface response, I'm going to lower the friction to 0.084 and the bounciness to 0.425. Again, it doesn't have to be exact, but for the effect of my original intro, the spheres had roughly these values. With the sphere still selected, we're going to go to the Materials tab and add a new material. Under Surface, we're going to select Glossy BSDF, and we're going to change the color to blue. And we're going to lower the roughness to 0.15. Now we have our first sphere, and what we're going to do is duplicate it a lot. This part can get computationally intense, so if you haven't saved in a while, you're going to want to start doing that regularly in case it crashes on you. Now we're going to want a top-down view for this part, so click the blue Z. Now with the sphere still highlighted, hit Shift D to duplicate it, then press X and slide the second sphere to the right with the mouse until it's beside the first one. You're going to repeat this step until there is an entire row of spheres going across the bottom. You can speed up this process by highlighting more than one sphere at a time by clicking additional spheres while holding Shift before hitting Shift D. While you're doing this, be careful not to accidentally highlight the plane. Now that I have an entire row of spheres, I'm going to highlight all of them and hit Shift D to duplicate the entire row, then hit Y to slide it upwards with the mouse. I'm going to repeat this step until there is an entire square-shaped matrix of spheres covering the plane. Now that we have this, we're going to get a side view of this by clicking on the green Y or the negative Y. Doesn't really matter which one in this case. Now we're going to highlight this entire side profile of our sphere collection. We're going to hit Shift D, then we're going to hit Z so we can move the duplicated collection vertically over top of the text. We're going to repeat this step numerous times until there are 10 layers of spheres over top of the text. Now, it should look something like this. Now, just to make sure that everything is working so far, I'm going to play this animation from the beginning. This will take some time because Blender has to calculate the position of all the rigid body structures frame by frame based on their physics properties. But what you should see is the spheres collapsing into the shape of a box. Keep in mind that any changes you make from this point forward will require Blender to recalculate all of this, so you'll need to drag the player back to 0 and repeat this process to ensure everything is still working as intended. But the good news is that the hard part is mostly finished. As you can see, I enabled viewport shading just to make sure that the spheres are blue. Now we have to animate the text mesh. Now the trick with this, for our purposes, is to leave the text alone until the spheres have all fallen and settled, which doesn't happen until around frame 100. That's where we're going to start the animation. So with the text highlighted, I'm going to go to the Object Properties tab. I'm going to mark a keyframe at frame 100 on the Z location. Then around frame 130, I'm going to put another keyframe where the Z location is now around 7.36 meters. Yet again, this doesn't have to be exact for now. In fact, I am going to tweak it later, but for now, this will give us a good sense of what we're working with. Now, since we changed a few things, we're going to bring the playback back to 0, and we're going to play this animation back all the way, and what we should see is the text comes up and takes a bunch of spheres with it. This is great, but some of the spheres won't roll off, which is why I made the text flip in the original intro. It wasn't just for show, I needed the text to be readable. So to do the flip, we're going to insert a keyframe for the Z rotation and a keyframe for the Y rotation around frame 125. And then we're going to insert another keyframe for both of those values around frame 154. The values here will be somewhere in the vicinity of 369 for the Y rotation and 14.7 for the Z rotation. Again, not necessarily exact, but that's the range you're looking for. That will give you a nice flip. Once you set that, drag the player back to frame 0 and watch it all the way again. Now that the text is animated, we're going to give it the shiny gold material. So with the text still highlighted, go to the Materials tab and add a new material. Change the surface to Glossy BSDF as we did with the sphere material. And with the color, I'm going to pick something in this gold range. Again, you don't have to do this exactly like mine, but that's a good point of reference. And once again, we're going to knock the roughness down to 0.15. Now I'm going to click on viewport shading so I can see the materials in action. Now that that's done, we're going to select the plane and apply the blue material to it. Now that we have our materials, we're going to add an HDRI background to light the scene. You can find HDRI images on websites like Polyhaven and HDR Labs. The one I'm using is Old Industrial Hall from HDR Labs, but you may want to choose a different one. After you've downloaded and extracted your HDRI, head to the World Properties tab, and where it says Color, we're going to click the yellow button, which opens up this menu. From this menu, you're going to select Environment Texture. Now we're going to click Open Image, which will open a File Explorer window. In here, you're going to navigate to where you put your HDRI and you're going to open it. For me, that would be fin4_ref.exr. So click it, Open Image, and there it is. And right off the bat, you can see the reflectivity. Now that we have an animation playing, we can start placing the camera. If we enter the camera view currently, we can see that it is currently buried under an avalanche of spheres. So obviously, we need to pull it up by the Z-axis before anything else. So select the camera, go to Object Properties, and from here, we can move and rotate it as need be. The trick with placing the camera is to play the animation until the point where the text has finished moving. Then pause the animation, then place and rotate the camera so that it can clearly see the full text. It is worth noting that if the edges of the box are not quite visible to the camera, it will help give the illusion of vastness. I can't give you an exact formula for this, and realistically you might be doing a lot of tweaking and fiddling by the time you're done, but it should ideally look something like what I have. Now there's a second part to this animation, which is when the spheres begin to fall into the abyss and disappear. That's where we're headed next. So first we're going to go to the Output Properties tab and increase End from 250 to 380 frames. After that, we're going to go to the Scene Properties tab, and under the Rigid Body World drop-down menu, and under Cache, we're going to change the end value from 250 to 380 as well. This will ensure that the rigid body remains active as long as the render is moving. After this, I have taken the opportunity to adjust some of the keyframing for the text and the camera framing. This part is mostly a matter of personal preference here, but don't be afraid of tweaking things like this during the process if it doesn't quite look the way you want it, but you can also just leave it as is. During this process, I discovered that a sphere got stuck inside the text after it finished animating, so I figured I'd just delete that sphere and restart the animation, since one missing sphere isn't going to be a big deal when there are hundreds of others still there. After rewatching the animation, another sphere got stuck in the same location, so I deleted that one too and started the animation yet again. Thankfully, the issue did not repeat afterwards. With that tweaking out of the way, the next thing I did was highlight the floor plane, mark a keyframe for each of the scale values at frame 260, then moved forward to frame 301 and marked another keyframe for the scale, and changed the value to 0. This way, the floor shrinks, which makes the spheres drop from the edge all the way to the center. To add to this effect, I also keyframed each of the walls I made earlier to rise up a few meters before the floor started shrinking. I temporarily made them visible so it was easier to visualize what was actually going on. The effect is that the spheres would spill out of the sides of the box that I created. Once this was finished, I went to the Render Properties tab, and under the drop-down menu labeled Film, I checked the box that said Transparent. This made the HDRI background invisible, but allowed the lighting properties to remain intact. It also allows the final render to have a transparent background. Now the only issue I had was that the animation would end before the spheres fell out of view of the camera. So I went to the Output Properties and increased the end value in the frame range from 380 to 480. Then I went to the Scene Properties tab, and under Cache, under Rigid Body World, I increased the end value from 380 to 480 as well. Then I replayed the entire animation from the beginning and encountered another issue. which is that the spheres don't fall into the abyss so much as just pop out of reality once they've reached a certain depth. To fix this, I highlighted the camera, went to the camera properties, and where it says end under the lens menu, I increased the distance from 100 meters to almost 1300. After I did this, I just did some more tweaking with the camera angle and placement to make sure the spheres had fallen out of its view by the final frame. I went to the end of the animation and started positioning the camera so that the text was still visible, but the last sphere was just out of frame. The final step was to make the text spin and shrink to disappear, so I keyframed all the scale dimensions and the rotation angles around frame 394, went to frame 441, and switched them all to 0. At this point, I did some more polish. I made everything invisible except the spheres, highlighted them all, and went to Object and clicked Shade Smooth so they didn't have that polygonal look. The animation is finished, and now it's just a simple matter of rendering it out. So under Output Settings, I opened the Output drop-down menu, clicked on the folder, and chose my preferred directory. Then, I changed the file format to FFmpeg Video, changed the container to QuickTime, and switched the video codec to QTRLE/QT Animation. Then, back up here, I switched the color setting to RGBA. These specific settings are important because they give the video a transparent layer. I played the animation all the way through from the beginning just to make sure everything was working. Finally, I switched the frame start value to 96 because I wanted the video to start after the spheres had settled and before the text rose out of the ground. Then, I set it to render. And just to show you the end result of all this, I brought the video we just rendered into DaVinci Resolve along with some generic footage of Elden Ring that I happen to have. I placed the intro I just made over top of the Elden Ring footage, and as you can see, the spheres and text disappear to clearly show the footage behind it. And that is how I made my Blender intro.